One of the most notorious accounts in the unfolding of the American Revolutionary War was the winter that Washington and his soldiers endured at Valley Forge. It was brutal. The winter was icy. The lodgings were poor. There wasn't quite enough food. There were diseases going around. Men died of starvation, frostbite. There were mass desertions where large groups of troops would simply flee. It was a pivotal moment in the Revolutionary War because if something wasn't done to turn around the morale, the American troops were all but doomed. Washington took charge and began to reiterate to these men repeated promises of what was in store for them if they stayed. Not just back pay, salary that was owed to them as soldiers, but grants of land. Basically a promise of a new kind of life that if they were to stay in the army, keep pressing forward, that when the war was over, they wouldn't simply go back to the kind of situation they had found themselves in before. They weren't just promised square zero, but something much better. And those promises of land, of a new identity, a new kind of lifestyle, a new kind of freedom, affected so many of the soldiers that this situation was turned from something that was almost a guaranteed permanent defeat for the American forces into something very different. Men who decided not only to stay, but their loyalty to George Washington as their general was galvanized as they pressed through starvation, frostbite, and the same kinds of difficulties that they had before, knowing that if Washington promised this for them, that they could count on it. In those moments, Washington understood that these men needed not just to have these things waiting for them at the end of this terrible, brutal gauntlet of difficulties and diseases and tragedies, but they needed to know. They needed to be reminded constantly of these promises, the things that were awaiting them, because even though it didn't change the circumstances of the situation, knowing what awaited them was what gave them a different sort of outlook on what they were enduring. They knew that this was not meaningless suffering. They knew that there was something costly happening, and yet costly in such a way that it was purchasing for them and future Americans a different kind of life. The promises that Washington made to these men was not just a helpful thing when they were fulfilled. Obviously, after the Revolutionary War, these men who got these land grants, of course it was useful to them then. But it was a lifeline of hope when they were enduring difficulty for the sake of chasing after these things. The promises that God gives us in the gospel, the promises of salvation, namely an erasing of our record of sin, the promise that we will not face condemnation when we stand before God, the promise of eternity not in hell under his just punishment, but in a new and beautiful eternity marked by Christ's presence and celebration. These kinds of promises, these promises where God in his mercy has presented these to us and reminds us of these things, they sustain us as we await our final hope. God's merciful promises are like nothing else. And just like Isaiah told us in the passage that we read early this morning, to have a perfect peace, that is to say, a peace that doesn't have pieces missing, can only come from resting in God's merciful promises. And we're going to look at some of those in Genesis 21, if you want to turn there with me. In Genesis 21, we see kind of a turning point in the story of Abraham. And it's a turning point because this chapter starts with something we've been anticipating for several chapters now. We see really kind of an emotional roller coaster in three different distinct accounts in chapter 21. One that's remarkable for the miracle involved, one that's remarkable for the conflict involved, and one that's remarkable in how unremarkable it is, how mundane it seems that it's included in this pivotal chapter. In other words, it's a remarkable chapter in that it contains the kinds of sensations that we experience in our lives, and yet the common thread running through all of these situations are God's merciful promises. So my hope is that as we look at this chapter today, as we see four essential truths we need to remember about God's merciful promises in the gospel. As we do so, that whether you're in a season of abundance or a season of difficulty or a season of uncertainty, you'll remember that the kind of peace that we need, the kind of hope that we need to sustain us can't come from anything here, but regardless of whatever our circumstances are, come from God's merciful promises in the gospel. The first one's this, we'll see in the first 7 verses of chapter 21, that God's merciful promises are a source of joy that you can't get anywhere else. You can't get them anywhere else. Look at verse 1 of chapter 21. Moses writes, "The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised." So this is Moses framing the story theologically. He says the same kind of thing, a very similar notion, twice. God did what he said. He did what he promised. This promise that we're going to find out is the birth of their child Isaac, is something that we know was something that was clung to inconsistently by Abraham and Sarah. Abraham laughs when God tells him he's going to have a son because it just sounds so ridiculous. It sounds so ridiculous, something he dare not hope in, because if he hadn't had a son by then in his old age, what reason would he have to put stock in this kind of a promise? Sarah laughs. She laughs in a way that is it seems less characterized by the absurdity of this old man having a child and more like a cynical sort of laugh, like, yeah, right. But chapter 21 starts with a very definitive statement. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. All throughout even just these 2 verses, what we see is God did exactly what he said he would do. He did it in the time frame he said he would do it. It didn't matter that Sarah laughed. It didn't matter that Abraham laughed. Even this laughter marked even the significance of the name that God told Abraham to give him. Give him the name Isaac, a child of laughter. God did exactly what he said. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. God was not late. There was nothing about Abraham's circumstances, even circumstances of difficulty and trial and complication that he brought on himself, like lying about whether he was married to this woman or not that we read about last time. It doesn't matter. God did exactly what he said he would do in the time frame he said he would do it. In verse 3, Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. Now it's funny, that phrase that's inserted there, whom Sarah bore him, it's like a gentle reminder that this is actually not the first son that Abraham had. We read several chapters ago that as Sarah is becoming impatient with this promise that Abraham's going to have a son in his old age, she decides to take matters into her own hands. There seems to be this indication that she says, okay, well, clearly we've misinterpreted something that God said, or he's forgotten you or something. So why don't you take my maidservant Hagar as your wife? She's young, she's fertile, she can have a baby for you. And he does. He has a son named Ishmael. There's a relational complication here, because now this woman who is supposed to be subservient to Sarah has a reason to feel elevated above her. She's now also a wife, and she has a child, and Sarah does not. We see all sorts of difficulties that arise from this, and yet it still does not subvert God's plan. But there's a qualification here. Moses says the child that was born, that is to say the child that Sarah bore him, that is to say the child that God originally promised, which was not Ishmael, he was named Isaac. Everything here is wrapped in a reminder that these things are unfolding according to God's plan. That this is a child that could only have been born according to God's power and according to God's decree. Verse 4, and Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. So here again, the fact that he names him Isaac and the fact that he circumcises Isaac on the day that God commands baby boys to be circumcised means he's acknowledging the fact that this really is a baby from God. Even the way that Abraham responds to the birth of this child is in accordance with what God has told him. Verse 5, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Moses stops and says, we need to think about the fact that this was clearly a child who was born according to God's supernatural decree. Abraham was 100 years old. Even in this time, even at a time where men and women lived longer generally than they do now, not nearly as old as they did in the early chapters of Genesis. And that even had babies later. We read that like even Abram, back when he was called Abram, his father had children when he was 70. But even for this time, to have a child at 100 years old was unheard of. And so Moses begins to frame the unfolding of this story, even just as we've just read in the previous chapter about Abraham messing things up with Abimelech, a king of the Philistines, by telling him that Sarah is his sister, not his wife. And so just like Pharaoh did years before, he takes Sarah into his harem, and it creates this huge issue. In chapter 21, it's like Moses is reiterating here that everything still happened exactly as God had promised. That despite his best efforts, Abraham could not mess up God's plan. Even the fact that Abimelech took Sarah to be one of his wives or concubines or something, that the Lord prevented him from being physically intimate with her. He prevented, in fact, all the women of that household from having any children. It's like God was intervening on Abraham's behalf to keep him from trying to derail the plans that God had for him. In verse 6, and Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. Here we see Isaac, the son whose name sounds like the Hebrew word for laughter, and who was prophesied about by angelic visitors to Abraham and Sarah a year before, was given the name in a context in which Sarah laughs out of cynicism, out of a jadedness. She even says at that time, really, now that I'm old and worn out, will I have pleasure? There seems to be this indication here that she's bitter. God has withheld from her a happiness that she feels like without, she's incomplete, that she deserves. God calls her out at that time. Yahweh actually says, "Why did you laugh?" She says, "No, I didn't." He says, "Yes, you did." She's busted. Oh, you really laughed? You scoffed at God's promise that you'd have a child. And here she says, he really is the son of laughter. But the laughter here is not cynical. It's happy. This is genuine laughter. She laughs because she's overjoyed that in her 90s she would have a child. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. This is news that is not just joyous for me, but joyous for other people who are going to hear about it. Verse 7, and she said, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." She says, "This is crazy. Who ever heard of a 90-year-old woman having a baby? And yet here I am." Moses, as he writes this account, and again, we look to the context of the passage itself. And we look to the context of the passage itself in light of the context in which it was written. That is to say that Moses is framing this story in such a way as to encourage God's people. That God did this incredible thing, this thing that seemed so ridiculous, this thing that by human effort never could have happened. And he did it in exactly the time frame that he said he would, under exactly the circumstances that he said he would. Nothing about this was a surprise. And despite Abraham's mess-ups, despite Sarah's cynicism, her bitterness, that had nothing to do with it. Sarah, in her old age, finds herself experiencing a joy that never could have come from human effort. God's merciful promise to Abraham and Sarah brought them a joy that they could never otherwise have experienced. It was a kind of satisfaction, a kind of celebration that God would do exactly what he said he would for these people who, for no earthly reason, are deserving of this. As we see this remarkable new birth, this life that couldn't be had any other way, we're reminded that God's merciful promises are a source of joy that we can't get anywhere else. When we look for lasting peace, when we look for a kind of security, a kind of rest in the things that this world offers, we will inevitably find ourselves disappointed. When we look at God's promises through the lens of what we feel like is attainable by human effort, like Sarah did, we rob ourselves of the kind of comfort and hope that could be ours, just like Sarah did for herself. That she would scoff at God's promise and then be just as surprised as anybody else that God delivered on it at the time that he said he would. God's merciful promises are a source of joy you cannot get anywhere else. Secondly, God's merciful promises don't come from our earthly situation. Look at verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So the child, Isaac, is an infant. And they throw a party. It's kind of like a rite of passage, like he's not a nursing baby anymore. And in the midst of this context, we see another instance of laughter. And yet again, not all laughter is created equal. Throughout the course of the rest of this passage here, we see Moses refraining from naming Ishmael, because the emphasis is not on Ishmael as a person, but on the fact that there is this complication, this other child, and this other wife. It's funny, even the way that Moses characterizes Hagar is not coincidental. He doesn't say Hagar, the slave woman, or Hagar, Abraham's second wife. But it says that Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian. She's characterized as someone who encapsulated this desire for Abraham and Sarah to try to find their own means of security, of prosperity. This false sense. The fact that she's Egyptian would not have gone unnoticed by Moses' original readers. You remember, Moses wrote this book, this account of the early days of God's promises to people who were on the cusp of entering into the promised land, and Moses understood better than anybody else the fickle, weak-minded nature of these people. People who had already, repeatedly, as they wandered in the desert, pined for the old days of Egypt, looking at their past, where they were whipped and beaten and forced to build things, and where their baby boys were killed so that they couldn't have more babies. To say, boy, the old days in Egypt were so nice. We could have stayed there. Maybe we should go back there. Maybe the key to prosperity, maybe the key to having a life that's marked by a richness and a satisfaction and a peace, maybe it's found in Egypt. Moses says, from the very beginning days of you as a people, Egyptians represented a false prosperity, a false promise fulfillment that was attained by human effort. And this child of the Egyptian is laughing, but he's not laughing with a shared joy like Sarah talked about a couple verses before. He's scoffing. He's mocking. How stupid is this? This old lady with this toddler. So verse 10, so she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. This is similar to a previous account that we read about after Sarah says to her husband, you know what, take Hagar. Maybe she can have a baby. Maybe this is how we're supposed to fulfill God's promise, as if she needs to brainstorm in order to figure out a way to deliver on God's promise to her. And as soon as Hagar has a baby, Sarah says, I cannot believe what you would do. Wow, Abraham, the nerve that you would take this slave woman to be your wife and she'd have a son. I cannot believe you would have a plan like this. And Abraham says, understandably, okay, what do you want me to do? I did what you said, and now you're mad that I did what you said. What do you want me to do? While Moses emphasizes the fact that Hagar is an Egyptian, Sarah here twice in this little bit of dialogue emphasizes the fact that this is a slave woman. Now she was, by all accounts, Abraham's wife. But she doesn't want to say, take your other wife, the wife that I told you to take, and cast her out. She says, this slave woman. In verse 11, the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. Ishmael is older now. He is the only son of Abraham. And Abraham says, I don't know, you've had me do this before. It didn't work out that well. And I hate the idea of just exiling my son. I know it's a complicated situation, but I didn't feel right about doing it before, and I don't feel right about doing it now. And in that situation, he sends Hagar and Ishmael away, and God sends them back. Actually, God sends an angelic messenger to preserve them and to tell them to return to Abraham's household. But here, verse 12, but God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he's your offspring. He says, this time do it. Ishmael and the slave woman, it was my will that they should stay in your household for a certain amount of time, but that then they need to go. There's this sense that they were sort of tangentially related to Abraham, the one through whom the covenant promises would come, but that they weren't permanently associated with him. And there's this sense here that Abraham is missing and that God is expressing, and that even in that Galatians passage that we read, Paul makes clear that to be biologically connected to Abraham is not the thing. You know, the whole letter that Paul writes to the church of Galatia is addressing the fact that these people wanted to sort of unwind the freedom of the gospel that they had experienced and instead go back to this ethnically based and religious behavior based religion system, that they walk with God because of who they are as ethnic Jews and who they are in terms of obeying the laws. And Paul says, listen, if to be a child of promise, if to be a recipient of the covenant promises was strictly related to biological descent, then Ishmael would have been a child of promise. He's Abraham's biological son, the firstborn son. By all accounts, culturally, Ishmael should have been the heir. Hagar was a wife. Ishmael was a firstborn son. It says, but Ishmael represents bondage. He was a son of the Egyptian. He represents the human striving after creating a particular situation. Well, Isaac, the son born to Sarah in her old age, the second-born son of Abraham, who is the heir according to God's promise, represents God's accomplishing of something that no human effort could accomplish. When we strive after constructing a situation for ourselves to take comfort in, what we do is we set up an illusion for ourselves. If we say, okay, God's promised me security and He's promised me peace. Okay, well, clearly what He expects me to do then is construct a situation for myself that I can then have peace in. Maybe that means I need to live in such a way that I glean a certain level of respect from everyone around me, or I have X number of dollars in my bank account, or as long as my health or my family situation or whatever it is the way I construct it to be, I can take refuge in that. That must be what God's referring to. But here we see this turning point, this inflection where God says, yeah, send the woman away with the child. He's not the heir of promise. You thought you could construct this sort of plan A for yourself so that if God comes through, you've already made stuff happen. It says that Ishmael was never my intended covenant child. He's not the one. You can't construct this situation for yourself and then pretend that that was me fulfilling my promises to you. God's merciful promises don't come from our earthly situation. Thirdly, God's merciful promises come to those who aren't even looking for them. Verse 14, so Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Gives her a little bread and a little water. He says, all right, you got to go. It's not the first time this has happened. So she goes off. She's nowhere to go. She's lived in Abraham's household for years. She has a young boy that she's responsible for. And the hopelessness of her situation doesn't seem to turn around. Look at verse 15. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. She has no food. She has no water. She and her son are dying of starvation and dehydration in the wilderness. And she believes that she simply has one recourse. The only thing that she can control in her life. The only thing that she has initiative over, prerogative over, is, well, the only thing that's presented to me is the decision to either watch my child die or not watch it. So I choose to not watch it. In Hagar's mind, that is the only decision point that she has. What else can I do except decide either to see my child die, to be with him when he dies, or not to watch it? I can't bear to watch it. It's interesting that this is also unfolding in a relatively similar way to when she was kicked out of the house the first time. She wanders in the wilderness. She's hopeless. And an angel comes to her as she's crying in despair. He says, hey, it's going to be okay. Your son's going to be Ishmael, which means God hears. He's heard your cry. What's interesting is in that passage also, she's not pleading to Yahweh to save her. She's just upset. She's in despair, and God intervenes. She's not asking for God's help, but God heard the fact that she was in need and brings her mercy, sends her back home. She has the child as he said she would. And even in that time, she is astounded by God's intervening mercy. She says, you are truly the God who sees. You saw me. You paid attention to me. But here, it doesn't occur to her, well, boy, the last time this happened, I was out in the middle of nowhere, and the God of Abraham came and sent a messenger to save me. Maybe I can ask him for a similar kind of help now. The God who sees, the God who saved me supernaturally in the same exact kind of situation years ago. But she doesn't. She says, well, I can't possibly think of anyone who could help me in this situation. I guess I'll just lay him down under a bush so I don't have to see my child die of dehydration. and I'll go die over here. In verse 17. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is." God does exactly the same thing that he did for Hagar in the wilderness all those years ago. She's crying, not to him, but just simply out of despair and hopelessness. And God has his angel intervene miraculously, supernaturally, and encourage her. Hey, it's okay. I heard the cries, and I'm going to do something about it. Verse 18, Up, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Ishmael is not the child of promise. Ishmael and Hagar do not belong to the household of promise. They were sort of like temporarily attached to it, but they don't really belong. Even here we see, as he grows up, an even more distinct singular association with Egypt and Ishmael. The fact that his mother took for him a wife from Egypt. She's an Egyptian. She wanted him to have an Egyptian wife. He becomes much more associated with his Egyptian mother's heritage than his Hebrew father. But he's preserved. In the first part of this passage, we see a child come to Sarah who scoffed at God's promises. He brought her joy. He brought her laughter that she couldn't have otherwise had. She certainly didn't deserve. And here we see a woman who is in the same kind of helpless situation she found herself in years ago. And it never occurs to her, maybe I should call out to the God who astounded me with how he saw me all those years ago when this same exact thing happened to me. And God, in this situation, says, I heard the cries of the boy. Previously, he says, I heard your cries. Again, they weren't cries to him. They were just simply cries of despair. And what we see here is God extending his mercy. Not to people who ask for it, who are savvy enough to say, I need to appeal to the Lord for this, but simply people who need it. Don't think that the reception of God's mercy is contingent on whether or not you are smart enough to look for it. Or that God will only extend to you the help and the security and the peace that you need when you approach him in the right way, you approach him diligently enough or consistently enough. But God's mercy is exactly that, undeserved favor, given to those who need it, who could never otherwise gain it for themselves. God's merciful promises come to those who aren't even looking for them. In John chapter 1, as John is unfolding the prologue of his book, he says something remarkable. He says that to all who received him, that is to say, who received Christ, they were given the privilege of being born, not according to the flesh, not according to a husband's will, but according to God and his will. We see that to be in Christ means to receive a new kind of life that comes by way of God's mercy, even to those of us who are not only undeserving, but not even looking for it, who could never create that situation on our own. And finally, God's merciful promises sustain us in the difficulties of this life. So we see a kind of dramatic unfolding of God's covenant promises. This is one of those points in Abraham's life where, like, there's a distinct acceleration in God's plan for him. You know, we see these remarkable situations like God calling Abraham, God providing him with land or giving him victory over these kings as he rescues Lot, or Abraham witnessing God's destruction of these wicked cities, or Abraham receiving angelic visitors, talking with Yahweh, friend to friend. God giving Sarah a baby, as he promised. And yet it's easy for us to forget that the things that we read about that stick out to us as kind of high points in this unfolding story in the Genesis narrative were just like punctuation marks between years of seemingly mundane, tedious, endless wandering around. Normally, we read about those times in very brief snippets, like a concluding statement after some remarkable situation. Like, oh yeah, and then, Abraham spent the next 5 years wandering around. So here, as we see the next section of chapter 21 unfold, we might expect, okay, wow, something else truly remarkable is going to happen. Something supernaturally astounding is going to happen. Verse 22, at that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now therefore swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity, but as I have dealt kindly with you, so you will deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I will swear. Abimelech, if you remember, was the king we read about last week who was really treated very unfairly by Abraham. Abraham was so determined to, or so scared that Abimelech was going to kill him so he could take Sarah, his wife, that he said, well, she's my sister. And then is shocked that Abimelech says, well, great, if she's just your sister and not your wife, then I can claim her for my own. Same exact situation that Abraham had constructed years before, and as we find out in that passage, Abraham's excuse for saying this to Abimelech, because Abimelech says, why did you say she was your sister when she's your wife, man? Like, I obviously wouldn't have taken her as a wife if I had known she was your wife. And Abraham feels like he's justified by saying, well, I say that everywhere I go. Like as if that's a reasonable excuse. Well, it's fine. I lie to everybody that same way. It's not just you. So Abimelech is seeing two things unfold with Abraham. This man who is clearly blessed by God. He's 100 years old. He has a baby. Despite the fact that he's a wandering nomad, his household just keeps expanding with wealth, prosperity. So Abimelech knows, number one, okay, clearly there's some kind of deity that really has a soft spot for this Abraham guy. But he also knows, number two, Abraham is not totally trustworthy. He's tricked me before and he created real problems in my household. None of the women in my household could have babies because Abraham tricked me. So he feels like something needs to happen here. Listen, Abraham, we need to make a deal here that one, because I can see that God's blessing you, that you're not going to wrong me, you're not going to trick me. Abraham says, okay. Verse 25, when Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you've set apart? He said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand, that this may be a witness for me that I dug this well. Therefore that place was called Beersheba, because there both of them swore an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. So we see that when Moses, in a few verses earlier, referred to the fact that Hagar was wandering in the wilderness of Beersheba, that he's referring to the name that would very soon after actually be given to that place. And it would seem, based on how the story unfolds, that the well that God opened Hagar's eyes to see was this well that Abimelech and Abraham are quarreling over. Abimelech comes to Abraham and says, I know God has blessed you, but I don't quite trust you, so let's make a covenant together. Abraham says, okay, but then soon after says, listen, your servants are making use of this well that doesn't belong to you. It belongs to me, so now I need to make a covenant with you that you won't take my stuff. Abimelech says, okay, here's some lambs as a sign of this covenant. I'm trying to deal honorably with you. And it's like we can read this passage and say, okay, so when is the wild supernatural thing going to happen? Is God going to come down and smite Abimelech and his forces? It's like what happens in wrapping up this passage for us as we transition to something, again, remarkable that's going to happen in the next passage is that God has shown his faithfulness. He's shown a very distinct sort of chapter marker in his unfolding plan for Abraham and his descendants. And after doing so, Abraham continues to wander in the land. He continues to have real estate disputes with his neighbors. Continues to have to carve out a nomadic living for himself with things like wells that need to be defended, that need to be guarded, with livestock, with complicated relationships with the other people in the land. In other words, God gives Abraham this son, this long-awaited son. He brings new life into Abraham's family that's a confirmation that he can be trusted and that he's faithful to deliver on his promises. And yet, the ultimate fulfillment of God's promise that his descendants would inherit all of this, they defeat their enemies, that all the nations of the earth would be blessed, is still far away. Abraham still finds himself in the context of mundane life. The same sort of difficulties that he was entangled in before this happened. Abraham was not whisked out of the same kinds of difficulties he found himself in before, but we find that there is a turning point here. We're going to see it very distinctly in chapter 22 in terms of Abraham's trust in the God who gave him Isaac. But what we see is Abraham needing to navigate the same kinds of mundane difficulties he had before, but now in a way in which his North Star is honoring the God who gave him Isaac and making decisions life decisions, real estate decisions, socio-political, diplomatic decisions, according to that identity that he has as the recipient of God's covenant promises. Abraham could navigate difficulties differently because of the God to whom he belonged. We saw this earlier in kind of a high point after he rescues Lot. And the king of Sodom says, hey, you can take all this treasure. And Abraham says, I'm not going to. And the reason he gives is because Yahweh has blessed me, and I don't want to take all this stuff and give the mistaken impression to the people around me that it's actually the fact that I'm a warlord like you guys from Sodom and Gomorrah that I'm being blessed. In other words, he makes an unusual decision, a counterintuitive decision, because of his identity as the recipient of God's promise. And he makes the same kind of decision here. He's still facing the same kinds of life difficulties he always has, and that even the other peoples around him would have to face with each other, but does so in a way that's grounded in the certainty of God's mercy, the certainty of receiving what God has promised him. God's merciful promises in the gospel. The promise of salvation, of hope, freedom, liberation from bondage to sin. They sustain us as we await our final hope. God's merciful promises are a source of joy you can't get anywhere else. God's merciful promises don't come from our earthly situation. His merciful promises come to those who aren't even looking for them. And God's merciful promises sustain us in the difficulties of this life. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you that the gospel is good news precisely because in the gospel, Christ brings us exactly what we need. As people who are lost in darkness, condemned because of our sin, our separation from you, that the gospel is good news because in Christ you've accomplished everything that we need. That our sin is paid for, your wrath is assuaged, our eternity is secured, Christ's righteousness is applied to us, and yet we grasp these things by faith. These are not physical realities, but spiritual ones. And those realities ground us. We have the privilege of weathering the various situations in which we find ourselves differently, precisely because of what Christ has done for us. So I pray, Father, by your Holy Spirit, help us to live as your people, people who are anchored in perfect peace because of our trust in who you are, what Christ has done for us, in being the tangible effector of your merciful promises. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.